All right, it's April 30th, last day of April. Running a little behind on a few things just due to the weather, but everything's coming along nicely so far. Here we're looking at the sweet corn. I've thinned out and drawn up the dirt along the sides of all of the sweet corn. And here we also have the Tiger's high beans, which are coming along quite nicely. This row in particular is doing well. Now, because of all of the rain that we've had in the last several weeks, I've had to dig a little drainage ditch here. This area of the garden is a bit of a low point. A lot of the water tends to settle back here. So for that reason, I've run a few little ditches here just to drain away the excess water. Now what we're looking at here, the area where the dirt's been drawn up is lower now, and so when we get rain, we're expecting a 1 to 3 inch rain tomorrow and possibly over the next few days. So when that happens, that excess rain is going to drain off down into the ditch. I've also left the irrigation ditches between the double rows open so that the excess can drain out. Right here we're looking at some of my agate soybeans. Now likewise, we've done the same thing over here with all of the potatoes. Now you can see up in here how dark and shaded it is. Works really well because over time, when the potatoes start popping up out of the ground, if they get exposed, they can get sunburned. You don't want too many of your potatoes getting sunburned. That sunburn is going to be toxic. You don't want to eat that. So anyway, but we've filled up the dirt along the side, which that'll provide ample cover on the outside, and it will also help keep the excess moisture away from the potatoes, because right now they're making potatoes in there, and so long as the moisture content of the soil stays perfect, that optimum level, just kind of the Goldilocks rule here, just right, not too wet, not too dry, then the potatoes will continue to grow as they should. If they get too wet, they'll start to rot right in the ground. So, which is the reason why I've drawn as much dirt up as I have. It also pulls all the potatoes together here. You see how dense that canopy is. That's going to shield not just sunlight, but also rain. So a certain amount of the rain is going to roll right off of the leaves down to the ditches on either side of the rows. Likewise, that heavy canopy cover is going to keep the sunlight from penetrating into the irrigation ditch, which is going to do three things. It'll keep any potatoes that are reaching the surface from getting sunburned. It's also going to prevent weeds from growing up between the rows, weeds and grass, because there's going to be no sunlight for them to grow from. And lastly, once we start getting hot and dry, it will keep that shaded and it'll keep it moist. You'll have a lot less evaporation, a lot less water loss due to evaporation down that irrigation path. Now these are some of the smaller ones. I have fertilized with a little bit of chemical fertilizer. I had a little bit of leftover phosphate in a bucket I'd put out and distributed here, which phosphate, granular phosphate, is what I generally used up until a few years ago when I first started trying to use the rabbit and horse manure as an alternative, simply because I had plenty of it on hand and because it was a nicer alternative to some of the harsher chemical fertilizers. You can also use bone meal. I've used that. That works quite well, which some of the dust on here is actually bone meal dust. But I was having some thoughts as I was drawing all the dirt up today, and really since I put in the concrete floor in the rabbit alley, when I collect the manure now, it's actually a little bit stronger than it once was, and the reason being, I never thought about it until now, and it actually helps explain why these plants are so large and so green right now. When the rabbits urinate in the bottoms of the cages and it falls through, it gets captured in the manure pile beneath the cages, and then when I shovel it up, we actually get a small amount of nitrogen mixed in with our phosphate, which is just fine. You don't really need anything besides the nitrogen and the phosphate with the potatoes. Even though A few of these do tend to have blooms here and there. We're not growing them for blooms. Now with some of your other crops such as the squash and the beans, cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, etc., then we're going to want to have a little bit of potassium in there. Now the potassium, I use some chemical, some just 1717 fertilizer, but a lot of the potassium I actually gain from ash. And the way that I obtain that, I have a fireplace, so I keep all of my ashes out of my fireplace. And also from these lovely little guys here, the goats, being as we have them in a pen setup here, rather than in out in the field where they can browse at will, they eat some of the grass, but being as they are browsers, they need a certain amount of leaf material also, leaf forage. So we have plenty of yaupon holly growing everywhere out here. So every few days I'll go out, I'll take my pruning shears in the little golf cart, drive around and collect up yaupon. I'll throw to the goats. And there's actually a little pile. Well, we don't see the pile now, but you can see all of the brush that's left behind there from these little guys. Once they pick all the leaves clean, then I gather up the remaining sticks and burn them on a little small bonfire, and then scoop up the ashes, and then the ashes are used in the garden as potassium fertilizer. So between my rabbits, my chickens, and the litter left behind by the goats, I'm actually able to obtain virtually all of the necessary fertilizer, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphate, to grow a good garden. Now these, I'm still yet to weed. I haven't had the opportunity to weed those today. It's been a very busy day, and that's just going to have to wait until the next rain. These would be the Wando peas. Over here we have the Cherokee wax beans, and then I have a few other varieties of wax beans coming up here that I had to replant because the golden wax did not come up at all. It was a bit of a disappointment. Now we have some royal burgundy beans. They're like a green bean, only they're a purple color. Now, in the last video I explained that I was going to try something new with the barrels, and here's what we have. There's nothing fancy, simply a half barrel that's been cut off. In this one I planted some pumpkins. Over here we have some zucchini, another barrel of pumpkins, some more zucchini, the last barrel of pumpkins. We'll see how the pumpkins come up. Now, we also have a few other items over here. This actually is zucchini, and then I have some yellow baby watermelons, which is a small yellow meat watermelon. Then we have some eggplant. I've left this one empty. That one's actually going to have some probably some cucumbers in it. Now we have the last with the eggplant, and then from here on down I still have planting to do. But it's pretty simple really. What we see here, we have a barrel, half barrel cut off, and there's a mix of just soil from around in the garden, about 50%, and then the rest is made up of rabbit manure, a little bit of enriched soil that I had shoveled out of my chicken pens, which is a mixture of chicken manure, soil, and decomposed hay and litter that was left out during the wet part of the season to keep the pens dry for the birds. And then I also mixed into that some of the ash mixture that we discussed a few minutes ago, and mixed all of that up with a little bit of peat moss, and that is essentially our nice rich soil blend in here. And then I simply, for little fence posts here, just use a little bit of 1/2-inch conduit. I took some 1/2-inch 10-foot lengths of 1/2-inch conduit and cut them in half and drove them into the dirt, and that's what we have. And then we have a 2-foot wire fence setting above our barrels, and that is where everything's going to grow. Now I'd alternated over here between watermelons, pumpkins, and then squash or eggplant. The reason that I alternated was so that where we have our squash, they're going to basically come up and I'm going to tie them vertically. The other vines are just going to grow across the entire wire setup. Now here we have some of the peppers from a video or so back. They're really getting settled in and they're about to take off. So we still have a few more things left to plant in the beds. I also planted some of the watermelons in the traditional manner, roughly speaking. I make a hill to plant them in, but I also draw up the soil around them so as to make a water basin, because around here, as my grandfather used to say, we're never more than a week away from a drought here in Texas, and that is very true. Depending on what the water and the rainfall wants to look like, everything could be going just perfect, and then within a week's time the soil's dry. And in my particular garden area here, I have about a foot or so of topsoil, and then I have sand underneath that with a mixture of gravel. There is some clay deep underneath it, but I have about 2 feet of sand and gravel mix, which means this soil drains really well. So when it's rainy like it is now, I'm not too boggy out here. Everything stays fairly dry. And there I have my assistant here right now. She's helping dig out a few more basins for watermelons. But for the reason it's really well drained soil and works well now is going to be the detriment later on in another month or so when the rains start to subside. Then all of these different systems that I've worked out here with the reservoirs there, with the double row planting, that's all going to be quite evident why I've worked on those techniques, because water conservation is going to be of the utmost importance in about another month and a half. When everything else is dry and dying, these plants will still be able to persist with much less water, much less resources used than traditional farming, traditional homestead gardening, if you will. Anyway, I believe that's everything for now. The wind's starting to pick up a bit and it's getting cloudy, so I believe some of the rain may be headed our way any time now. Hopefully in the next video we'll have a few more things to demonstrate. Possibly a few more of my little inventions. I haven't shared any of those yet. I have a little bit of time here, so real quickly I'll demonstrate one. Now this little guy, the end was just a basic fork. It was actually my granddad's old garden fork, and it works well just for digging in the dirt. You can break up the soil a little bit. You can dig a little bit with the grass. But I actually I brazed it onto a piece of conduit for a handle, because the wooden handle basically rotted out, and then hammered out a piece of metal and ground it down sharpened it for a blade. Now this little guy works really well. Anytime you've got grass, it just cuts right through the surface of the grass. Now they make these. I just happened to decide to make one with a few minutes and a few pieces of metal. But the beauty of having it combined like this is once you've done your cutting, then you can just go right behind and you can rake up all the grass that you've cut off. Now hopefully in a few months, given ample time, I'm going to work on an attachment for one of my older front tine rototillers. As you can see, I have done a bit of tilling around here. In addition to raking up the dirt, I recently tilled everything to kill the weeds. Now right now we have enough soil moisture that that's not a problem. However, tilling is one of the biggest places where you're going to lose soil moisture. It is necessary to keep the excess grass and weeds down, but it's a two-edged sword. Every time you till, you're loosening up the soil and you're losing a lot of moisture. So I am actually going to work on the same principle with which that little tool has. I'm going to try to make something that looks similar to the old-fashioned reel mowers, but it's going to be in the form of two little cages that essentially slip on in place of the tines on the tiller. And that way, instead of tilling the ground and penetrating several inches into the soil and breaking it all up and disrupting the soil and releasing the soil moisture, all it's going to do is just skim across the surface and cut off all of the unnecessary grass and weeds. That's the idea. Now sometimes, anytime you're working on an invention, you'll have all the best intentions in the world, but oftentimes calamity will ensue, and you have to improvise, you have to make improvements, and you have to adapt the idea and the plan. which that's to be understood. But hopefully with a little bit of spare time, I'll be able to introduce that new one in addition to my my side dressing fertilizer tiller that I constructed a few years ago. I finally figured out one little adaptation to make that one work proper, and we'll try that little guy out as well. Now, that's all I have for now. Everybody have a wonderful day. Enjoy your spring. A good day and happy gardening.